If you want to know about Kris's background in economics and psychology, or about the awards her writing has won, or even about which sports teams she's passionate about, and by passionate I mean really, really passionate, I highly recommend reading the lovely bio available on tonight's program. I want to introduce you to another side of Kris. I met Kris at a meeting of a writers group back in 2015. The speakers at this meeting were very definite about how they thought people should write. At some point, a young man asked a question, and they shut him down. I decided at that point not to ask questions. Kris, however, raised her hand. She questioned their stance. They tried to shut her down too. She kept asking. She never raised her voice. She never called them names. She just asked enough questions so that everyone in the room could see that they were being very inflexible on a topic that required a lot of flexibility. At the time, I thought it was a fool's errand. Those two ladies were not going to change their minds. I introduced myself to Kris after the meeting, and we talked about it a little bit. She told me that changing their minds had never been her goal. She'd known they weren't open to anyone else's opinions. She'd known it the second they started speaking. Her concern was for the young man. It was important to her that he understand that he had options, that he didn't have to write his stories the way these people were telling him to write them, and that his own ideas had value. She said it was because she had a son who probably wasn't too much younger than this young man, and she'd want someone to do that for him in a similar circumstance. I went from thinking that she'd been on a fool's errand to wondering why I hadn't offered to drive her on it, or at the very least to hold her Chardonnay. Since then, I've gotten to know a lot more about Kris, but not more about who she is, that I learned at that meeting. Kris is the person who is always looking out for people who can't look out for themselves. She is always giving voice to people who don't have a platform from which to speak, and she's always trying to make the world a better place. Her emotional intelligence shines in her writing and in her life. So I present to you award-winning author and my friend, Kris Calvin.
So I wasn't going to say anything because having a work in progress read, I've learned, is a really vulnerable place to be. So I'm just interested and delighted that Kellie's going to share it with you. This is the second book in a series, and they're based in Sacramento. And I'm not going to say much more because it starts from the beginning of the second book, so you won't miss anything. Mostly I would like to thank Eileen for the warmest and nicest introduction I've ever had in my entire life. So thank you.
Tract by Kris Calvin. No one has to die. It was almost a question the way Dylan Johnson said it, or an unfinished sentence, a phrase that needed clarification. He knew there was little he could do to prevent it. He had the money, but not the power. Still, murder had never been part of the plan. The man seated across from Dylan offered only the suggestion of a shrug in response, the slight lifting of one shoulder. In his late 20s, Greg Miller had jet black hair that started in a widow's peak and ended in a blunt line just below his ears. It stood in stark contrast to his pale complexion, a toneless white, like milk drained of the cream. Despite his being thin, his short-sleeved prison-issued uniform revealed a sinewy, muscular frame. Dylan was 10 years older and dwarfed Greg Miller in height and weight. But unlike Greg, Dylan's body was soft and ill-defined. He felt himself sweating under his arms, on his palms. He considered shedding his Brunello Cucinelli sport coat, a light brown wool and silk blend that he acquired after seeing Daniel Craig wear one in the latest Bond movie. He hesitated, then decided to leave it on, unwilling to forego the mantle of authority that he believed the $5,000 custom-tailored jacket provided him. He didn't know what impressed Greg, but he wanted every advantage he could have. There was something decidedly creepy about the guy. Dylan experienced it every time he saw him. For one thing, Greg avoided eye contact, though not in a distracted or nervous manner. He would often level his gaze, intense and unflinching, right at the center of Dylan's forehead, as though by doing so he could read Dylan's thoughts. Dylan sincerely hoped not, because when he looked back at Greg, a telepathic vampire came to mind. The air inside the small, windowless room was stale and thin. Dylan had the fleeting thought that it had been breathed in and out by so many desperate individuals that the oxygen had been depleted. "I'll find it," Dylan said. "I'll find him. He's not much more than a boy." "What about the dirty cop?" Greg asked. Dylan frowned and shook his head. "There is no dirty cop," he said. Greg's handcuffed wrists lay easily in his lap, as though resting there by choice rather than as a byproduct of his captivity. His tone was even, bordering on disinterested, but his gaze remained fixed an inch above Dylan's eyes. "There's always a dirty cop," he said. Enough, Dylan thought. He couldn't waste any more time. He crossed to the door and knocked hard, signaling the guard that he was ready to leave. He tried to ignore the prickly sensation at the base of his neck that he felt when he turned his back on Greg. As he walked the long hallway past security, out of the confined spaces and into the summer heat, Dylan allowed himself a moment of optimism. He kept track of Marin Kane for years, first online, then nearby. He believed with all his heart that she was finally ready. All he had to do was see this through. Marin watched the tiny bubbles as they made their way to the surface. It was her first time using the upscale electric kettle, a gift from her colleagues the day she left the firm. The box had sat in plain view, unopened, on her kitchen counter for the past 6 months. The kettle's image tastefully displayed with the words, "Handcrafted Italian glass," in bold black letters across the top. As the bubbles multiplied, crowding against one another, she recalled the saying that a watched pot never boils. Not meant to be taken literally, of course, but the 3 minutes promised on the side of the box, cold to hot, start to finish, might feel interminable. Still, Marin Kane couldn't turn her head away. She'd never been one for letting matters take their own course, unmonitored, in case there might be something she could do to move things along. Besides, since she'd embarked on what she thought of as her fresh start, her new life, she'd noticed that her relationship to time had shifted. It no longer felt like something to be conquered or beaten back. The unyielding drive to move forward she'd had for as long as she could remember, a sensation not unlike running in place in a futile attempt to have one foot in the future before the present ended, had become less insistent. A large window over her kitchen sink provided a view of a mature red oak presiding over a stone patio that ran the length of the side of the house. She turned at the sound of 2 birds that seemed to be singing to one another, heralding the impending sunrise. The kettle emitted a barely audible click, and the water stilled. As Marin selected a mug, she heard the heavy deadbolt on her front door turn. Only 3 people knew the key's hiding place, under the last step. They all were aware she would be up and about at this hour, and any one of them would be a welcome visitor. "Marin, love, have you forgotten? I'm right screwed if we don't get to the mechanics before they open. I haven't an appointment." Polly Gray's crisp British tones echoed down the hall from the entryway. Friends for 5 years, she and Marin had long ago given up on the formality of waiting to be invited into one another's homes. Polly lived in the duplex across the street at 523B Matchbook Lane. Marin's address was 522. They sometimes received each other's mail by mistake. That's how they met. At 34, 5 years younger than Marin, Polly was the single mother of a teen and a respected professional, director of a prestigious internship program. But at just over 5 feet tall, slim and fit, with spiky short brown hair, if not for the sprinkle of soft lines around her eyes and mouth, she could have passed for a college undergrad. She was dressed in her usual all black, a plain black cotton top and black denim skirt with flat black sandals. The only color she wore was in the small, sparkling gems in varied hues that occupied the multiple piercings in her ears. When she pushed through the swinging door from the living room into the kitchen, Polly took in the glass kettle full to the top, condensation on its sides. The kitchen was small by modern standards, although a good size for its mid-century heritage. The oak cabinets and off-white Formica countertops were dated, but Mirren had replaced the electric stove with a high-end gas model. A vintage round chrome-legged table with matching red and chrome chairs occupied most of the floor space. "I suppose we have a bit of time," Polly said, crossing to a shelf by the stove to select a mug for herself. She took Mirren's from her hand, added tea bags, poured the water, and carried the steeping cups to the table. Not a single wasted motion in her actions. Mirren checked the refrigerator and several cabinets before locating a small white bakery bag containing the last of the muffins she'd purchased the day before. She had just joined Polly at the table and was deciding between banana and blueberry when she heard the deadbolt turn again, this time followed by heavy footsteps coming up the hall. Alec Jobin stopped in the doorway, his 6'2" broad-shouldered frame filling the space. He appeared surprised to find not one woman, but two in Mirren's kitchen before dawn. His smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Good morning, ladies," he said. "Morning, Senator." Polly seemed nonplussed, as though his appearance before the sun was up was right on schedule. "You've missed tea time. We're off to the mechanics, although there's a muffin or two left." Then, leaning close to Mirren, she whispered in her ear, "If you must have a morning shag, then you must. But make it quick. I don't want to be without a lift." Mirren blushed, which she was certain that it didn't go unnoticed by either of them. To give herself a moment, she stood and moved to the refrigerator to take out a yogurt. Mirren and Alec were back together after a rough spot in time apart, during which she dated a widower, a local homicide detective. Tommy Noonan had told her that in his line of work, he never thought his wife would go before him. When she ran into Tommy recently at a police association charity event, she'd found it hard to swallow, a raw heat still hovering between them. But seeing him again, she'd also been reminded that the one thing she couldn't abide was secrets. As she turned, she felt Alec watching her. "I came to get my running shoes. I must have left them here," he said. He crossed the room and gave Mirren a gentle half-kiss, his lips barely brushing against hers. But when he slid his hand from her waist to the curve of her hip, she knew he hadn't come for the shoes. "Right, then. I'm off," Polly said. When she picked up her purse, it began to buzz. She extracted her phone, the image of a toddler filling its screen. He had fine features, curly dark hair, and a quiet, thoughtful air about him. When little, Polly's son Jake had been the kind of kid about whom people commented, "He's an old soul." He would be 16 this coming Sunday. According to Polly, his dark curls were gone. She'd reported to Mirren in grave tones yesterday that he'd shaved his head, something about a dare related to his upcoming birthday. "No, love, I can't. I won't have a car." A note of exasperation crept into Polly's voice. She was frowning when she hung up, an expression that Mirren had noticed Polly had often of late when interacting with Jake. Alec must have seen it, too. With a politician's ease, he focused on Polly. "Last days of summer, I would have thought he'd be sleeping in." "He hoped to practice this morning for his driver's license exam. One of the lads told him that the bit on the highway was difficult. Not that he appreciates my instruction while he's at the wheel, but I think he's gone desperate." "I could take him," Alex said, "if you're okay with him driving my truck after I do a quick workout." A former Marine, now a California state senator, Alec was once asked in an interview about his obvious commitment to personal fitness. He'd responded that staying in fighting shape was proving to have equal survival benefits for the long days of grueling partisan debate in the capital as it had on the ground in Afghanistan. Lovely, I'll let him know, Polly said. Wait, he's lost his mobile. He called on the house phone. She reached in her purse, pulled out a small notepad with a miniature pen attached, scribbled a number on the top sheet, and tore it off to give to Alec. Ring him when you're ready. She was halfway out the kitchen door when she looked back at Marin, one eyebrow raised. Don't take too long. Finding those shoes. Detective Tommy Noonan sat curbside on a tree-lined street in Midtown Sacramento, his state-issued Taurus idling roughly. He focused on his breathing. Back when he was still seeing Marin, she talked to him into attending a yoga class, and that had been his takeaway. Dawn was breaking, the cloudless sky muted gray. The soft yellow light illuminated the porch of a modest ranch-style home where Officer Carlos Cifuentes was saying goodbye to the toddler in his husband's arms. Two men married to one another didn't offend Tommy. Seeing the loving couple and their son, all he experienced was envy. He checked the time. Carlos could make a sentence into a paragraph on any topic, even in conversation with a 2-year-old. And the child was smiling, all the encouragement Carlos would need. Tommy eased his foot down on the accelerator, revving the engine once. It seemed more polite than laying on the horn, and less likely to wake the neighbors. He tried to tamp down the sense of urgency he felt, since the guy face down near the river wasn't going anywhere. A few well-placed bullets had seen to that. Carlos kissed his son on the forehead and jumped from the low front stoop to the gravel path below. He broke into a jog to Tommy's car and was already talking as he opened the passenger door. Tommy found the young officer's Salvadoran accent soothing. Could be robbery, Carlos said, but my money's on another Nazi hit. As he shifted into drive, Tommy didn't bother to correct his young partner. Members of the hallowed 23 weren't Nazis, although the gang had its share of skinheads. Besides, Tommy knew he was better off not talking about recent white on black and brown killings in the Sacramento area. No telling what he might let slip. When they reached the approach to the overpass on Crestview Drive, Tommy felt the steering in the Taurus pull off center. It was an ongoing problem. He was distracted when Carlos's soliloquy on race relations became something else. Carlos was repeating himself, his tone urgent. There, see her, slow down. A woman was standing on the wrong side of a worn chain-link fence that barred access to a concrete ledge, 2 to 3 feet wide, 20 feet above the freeway. Her head was bowed, her back to them. Her dark hair fell in a single thick braid down her back, nearly reaching her waist. Tommy braked gently to a stop on the opposite side of the road. He didn't want to spook her. She removed her sweater, then pulled her t-shirt off over her head, revealing a plain beige bra. The line of her baggy jeans was encircled by a hot pink belt, a shock of color. If she was preparing for a swim, Tommy knew this was the wrong place for it. The river was 3 miles south. There was only solid concrete in all directions, 2 stories below her. 15 feet to her left, a bent gate hung crookedly from one hinge, wide open, as though mocking a nearby sign, no entry, city workers only. Tommy was calculating whether he could make it to the gap and along the ledge to where the woman stood before she jumped, if that was what she had in mind, when Carlos exited the car in one swift motion and took off at a dead run directly toward her. She turned her head, but Carlos was already there and had grabbed onto her belt through the chain-link fence. She strained against his hold, screaming. The fence bowed towards the edge, threatening to give way and take the woman and Carlos with it. She kicked, wailed, and writhed, the edge of her belt tearing into Carlos's palms. Tommy, a big man in his early 50s, was carrying a few extra pounds, but more muscle than fat. When he reached a spot where his partner stood, he found his hands too large to fit through the diamond-shaped openings in the fence. He put his arms around Carlos's waist and leaned back, his weight helping to pull the fence upright. There was something darkly comic about it, he thought. The woman on one side, he and Carlos on the other. A tug of war, except it was anything but a game. He heard sirens and doors slamming, the crackle of two-way radios. One black and white on the overpass behind him, and two forming an impromptu roadblock on the freeway below. He hadn't noticed any traffic. It was early, but someone must have seen them and called it in. Two officers approached. One helped steady the fence. The other tried to reach through to grab the woman's wrist, but couldn't get a purchase on it. She was in motion in all directions. Tommy stepped back, jogged towards the gate, and made his way onto the ledge. He figured there was plenty of room if he was careful, a few feet from the fence to the edge. Still, he didn't like it. It was long, a long way down. He kept one hand lightly on the chain-link fence for balance. When she saw him, the woman spoke. The first sound she made that morning that wasn't a scream. "Let me sit, please. I want to sit down." She looked smaller to Tommy now, in her bra and baggy jeans, her shoulders slumped, her energy gone. She was stuck standing, pinned against the fence. Carlos maintained his grip on her belt, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He made eye contact with Tommy. Tommy shook his head no. "It will be okay," Tommy said to her as he took the last few steps, then put his arms around the woman and held her close. Not out of sympathy, although he felt that, but to keep her from the edge. He nodded at Carlos to release his hold on her belt. Untethered at last, the woman tensed and jerked, and in one motion pulled herself sideways into the void, taking Detective Tommy Noonan with her. Marin lowered the top on her vintage VW Beetle, hoping that when she was up to speed, she'd be rewarded with a breeze. August in Sacramento was not for the faint of heart. Already over 80 degrees, it would reach triple digits by noon. Fortunately, the mechanic likely had an air-conditioned seating area. In any case, Polly shouldn't have long to wait. Finding the shoes had been relatively quick, all things considered. Still, Marin felt like a bit of a bad girl. She knew she should have been focused on meeting Polly so they could get on with things. Time was running out. 6 months ago, Marin and Polly had decided to go into business together, assuming the lease on a rundown child care center across the street from the Capitol. It was Polly's idea. She'd noticed the for rent sign on one of her morning runs. While she wouldn't give up her full-time gig in the Capitol with its benefits and stable income, she'd been looking for ways to augment her salary to better secure Jake's future. For Marin's part, she'd been itching to leave her position as a high-stakes state lobbyist for some time, and impulse buys were her specialty. Although committing to remodel and reopen a 3,000-square-foot shuttered preschool was undeniably on a much larger scale than her usual splurges on mid-century vintage furniture at yard sales. When she'd made the decision to partner with Polly, Marin had envisioned a more peaceful existence for herself, away from the unrelenting urgency of functioning in the political arena. Instead, as they prepared the center for the grand opening, she found herself once again juggling multiple deadlines, up against the clock. She wondered if her unerring ability to place herself in high-stress situations had been established in her childhood, or perhaps even embedded in her DNA, a gene passed down by long-ago bellicose ancestors. She was making good time through the city streets of Midtown and was optimistic about reaching Polly before her friend's infamously short patience expired. But when she reached the freeway approach at Crestview Drive, she found herself in a line of cars that wasn't going anywhere. She turned on the radio and scanned for a local traffic report, without luck. She settled for a new country station, not usually her thing, but Blake Shelton was singing about all he would give for the right woman. That would do. After 5 long minutes with 0 forward progress, there were as many cars behind Marin's Beetle as in front of it, all at a standstill. In her opinion, the modern country music that had sounded more like pop to her had outlived its usefulness. She turned the radio off. A moment later, chiding herself for not thinking of it sooner, she extracted her phone from her bag and opened its browser. California had a strict law prohibiting cell phone use while driving. Marin had been instrumental as a lobbyist in securing its passage, but she figured if her car wasn't moving, she wasn't driving. The fines for violation of the law were steep. She hoped if a cop happened by, they would see it the same way. A search for Crestview traffic yielded several links. Deadly leap off Crestview. Veteran officer dies in line of duty. 2 deaths before dawn. Marin's breathing quickened. Breaking news, unidentified police officer killed in failed attempt to save woman from suicidal dive off the Crestview overpass. The veteran homicide detective was headed to another call when he gave his life in the ill-fated rescue. She inhaled deeply and made an effort to reason with herself. There have to be at least a dozen homicide detectives working in Sacramento. But then she thought, how many of those detectives would be referred to as veteran? The defense she had been building toppled. She tried to ignore the tremor in her voice as she directed the phone to search the keywords Tommy Noonan. The screen filled with more links. Nearly all were several years old, related to the death of Tommy's wife. It had been front page news at the time. The only recent link was for the charity event where Marin had seen Tommy a few weeks before. She clicked on it to find him featured as having commanded the top price in the evening's auction of dates with bachelors and bachelorettes to support the department's youth activities. She recalled how uncomfortable Tommy had appeared on stage that night. She'd rarely seen him in a suit. A big man, he could have used more room at the waistline to accommodate the few extra pounds he carried. His hands thrust in his pants pockets, he'd kept his head down, appearing to study his dress shoes. The MC made her pitch. Next, this virile, dashing man in blue, you'll hope he brings out the cuffs. The audience had laughed. One woman and then another raised out their hands and their bids. Marin could have testified to Tommy being virile, absolutely, but not to the handcuffs. He'd never needed help to hold her captive once he touched her. Marin refreshed her phone. More articles and stock photos of the freeway, but no new detail on the officer who died that morning. She considered her options. Sitting in her car, waiting, wasn't one of them. Maneuvering her Beetle onto the shoulder, she exited and walked toward the towering overpass visible beyond a curve in the road. Rounding the turn, she scanned the scene. There was an ambulance, its rear doors open. 2 police cars and a pickup with orange cones on the back were parked nearby. Several uniformed officers chatted with the road crew. Marin looked at the ambulance's open doors and wondered whether the early reports might have gotten it wrong, whether someone could have survived that fall. Then she noticed a circle of pavement set off by cones beyond the vehicles. The asphalt within it was a deeper color than the rest. The sky was clear. The difference could be the product of a shadow cast by the early morning sun. But Marin knew it wasn't. It was blood, and a lot of it. She felt her stomach rise as though she were cresting the steepest hill of a thrill ride, one she desperately didn't want to be on.